Welcome to Emergence Magazine's podcast. I'm Emmanuel Vaughn Lee, host of this show and executive editor of Emergence Magazine, located on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Miwok people in present-day Marin County. Each week, we feature interviews, stories, poetry, and author-narrated essays exploring the threads connecting ecology, culture, and spirituality. The emergence of new scientific knowledge often fundamentally alters how we think about things, rewiring our perception of how the world works. But how can we take this knowledge and apply it to reimagine our ways of being? In this era of ecological breakdown, how can we take what we know and translate it into the practical? This week, renowned forest scientist Suzanne Simard returns to the show to speak about her latest book, When the Forest Breathes, and the groundbreaking findings from her decade-long Mother Tree project, which hopes to use its data to transform our forestry practices. Entwining Western science and traditional ecological knowledge, Suzanne takes us through what mother trees are telling us about how forests reseed themselves, and shares insights, both ancient and new, around the importance of tending to carbon stocks, the relationship between salmon and trees, and maintaining the continuity of relational networks for forest survival. Seeing how mother trees offer us a model for living in service to the future, she challenges us to shed our extractive ways of being and instead work practically with what the earth is showing us. Suzanne, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for having me.
When we last spoke, your book, Finding the Mother Tree, had just come out, which told your story of breaking free of the status quo around forest science, your groundbreaking research into the Wood Wide Web, and the fight you went through to make this discovery known within Western academia. And your new book, When the Forest Breathes, in many ways picks up where you left off, but perhaps dives more deeply into the science of the forest through the lens of a long-term study you call the Mother Tree Project. What is the Mother Tree Project, and what is it hoping to accomplish?
So the Mother Tree Project is the biggest experiment I've ever done. And, given that I work in forests, which are long-lived large creatures, it's a necessarily very large and long-lived experiment. So the idea of it is to test different ways of protecting legacies of the forest, the largest trees especially, what we call mother trees, and in different amounts and configurations, and compare them with what if you take them all away? That's what we call clear-cut logging. Or what if we just let the forest grow naturally on its own? And we're trying 5 different ways of doing this across this large climate gradient. It covers an area about the size of Denmark. It's a 1,000-kilometer latitudinal gradient, and it includes 9 different research sites where we're trying these 5 different harvesting, if you can call them harvesting or retention treatments. And then within that, we're also testing the migration of seedlings or migration of genotypes to keep up with the pace of climate change. And so then within that experiment, we're examining how the ecosystem is responding. How is it able to protect its carbon pools? How is it able to protect the biodiversity of the forest? How is it buffering climatic extremes? How is the regeneration of the forest faring? So we're 10 years into it, and we're getting some pretty cool discoveries so far.
There seems to be a main question at the heart of the project, which is, can we design our logging and harvesting practices to better emulate natural disturbance patterns in forests? Could you tell me a bit about this central question and where it emerged from?
Yeah, so there's been a paradigm in forestry that nature itself, Mother Nature herself, is a great example to emulate in forestry practices. That if we emulate the natural patterns in forests and try to, protect those legacies that create those patterns, that there's a greater probability of success of having a healthy forest going forward. And so we look at natural disturbances like the patterns of wildfire or insect disturbances in particular, and try to create like harvesting patterns, or we call them regeneration cutting methods in silviculture or silviculture systems, to emulate those patterns and protect those very legacies. And I would say, that was a really popular paradigm that was developed out of the Pacific Northwest in the U.S. in the late 1980s, early 1990s. It was adopted to a great extent in British Columbia and parts of Canada. And then it's actually shifted a little bit as we've become, I would say, even more extractive in our forestry in the last few decades, and really departed a lot from that paradigm of emulating natural disturbance to let's just get the wood out.
Right.
So, so that was the idea, is can we actually do this, and does it actually help protect the health of the ecosystem?
Talk to me about the urgency of reimagining our forestry and industrial logging practices. Why is this so critical now? I mean, it's always been something that, those who are ecologically conscious have looked at as a problematic way to harvest wood for our needs. But there seems to be an urgency now that is at the forefront.
Yeah. Well, I would like to first cast back, through time and say that historically we've known better ways to harvest trees from the forest, had a lighter touch, done selective harvesting. Indigenous people always did selective harvesting to meet their needs. Even when settlement occurred across the Americas, selective harvesting was kind of the standard. There just wasn't the capacity to take down a whole forest.
Right.
There was no need. And then that evolved into this sort of capitalistic driven extraction process called industrial forestry. And so today, if we look around the world, probably half of the forests have been affected in this way. Some would say they've been degraded in certain ways. And why is this so urgent that we get a handle on this? It's because forests are large natural sinks for carbon, and they also are home to the vast majority of biodiversity in the world. So if we're losing or degrading forests, we're actually degrading those two ecosystem services, if you want to call them. And it's an existential problem. And I would add that not only is it degrading, it's also we're counting on forests to be natural solutions to climate change. If you look at what the International Panel on Climate Change is saying, our priorities for dealing with or to mitigate, climate change, to bring down greenhouse gas emissions, these natural solutions, forestry is right there. It's about protection of ecosystems, restoration of ecosystems, better management of ecosystems. And yet, here we're doing practices that my research is finding isn't actually doing that. So it's really essential. We're counting on this, and yet we're not really following the guidelines that we've set out ourselves, that we know are tried and true practices.
Your work with the Wood Wide Web, which had huge resonance globally and ramifications in how people perceive their relationship with trees and forests, and this idea of communication and intelligence. I mean, it went far beyond the scientific establishment that I think you imagined it would influence when you put out that study all those years ago. And the Mother Tree Project in many ways seems like a natural evolution of trying to apply those learnings into practice, perhaps in a way you didn't conceive of back then. I'm curious about your journey and your scientific process, and to want to kind of put this into practice, put this into action. What took you there?
I'll just start with that. I grew up in forests. I understand forests in a deep ancestral way. When I was growing up in the 1960s, they were all old growth forests and primary forests. And I saw those forests get taken down, basically, through my lifetime. And there was I have a visceral, intuitive reaction to this that we're undermining our own vitality by doing this, and we don't need to do it. And so I wanted to take my research, which shows the connections in the forest, that the forest is an intimately connected place, that it is interdependent. It's based on these intimate relationships between all the creatures, all the beings in the forest, including the water and the soil and the forest floor and the trees and the animals. They're all in relationship and connected together. And by severing those linkages and sort of severing those relationships, we're actually unraveling the forest through the practice of clear cutting, which is the dominant form of forestry that's practiced in Canada and in many parts of the world, that we're actually severing those connections. So I thought, I want to take that fundamental knowledge that we learned through the work that's outlined in Finding the Mother Tree, that the forest is an interconnected place, that the energetic centers of the forest are these big old trees, what we call the mother trees. And how do we protect those? And so I really wanted to figure that out. Practical solutions that can be adapted and applied, and to demonstrate that we can do this in a different way. And we're finding that, the answers are right there in the forest. We're finding, these beautiful discoveries of you can apply this basic fundamental understanding to protect those relationships and therefore protect the integrity, which means the health and patterns of the ecosystem through careful stewardship.
You referenced earlier how there have been practices in the past where people knew how to selectively harvest. And of course, this brings up the history that dates back millennia upon millennia in Canada, the U.S., and throughout the world of Indigenous peoples' relationships with forests and more broadly traditional ecological knowledge. And you talk about this a lot in your book, and you referenced it in Finding the Mother Tree, but it's more dominant here and it gets into more detail. And so I wonder if you can talk about your relationship with traditional ecological knowledge and how this really informed the way you approach this project.
Yeah. So, I'm a forest ecologist, and so I understand the importance of place and people. And I did my research under the supervision of Dr. David Perry, who has Athabascan ancestry. And I didn't really know it at the time, but I was listening to him in a deep way. But I never really put it together. And I was working at UBC, and I met a postdoc. I got a postdoc, Dr. Teresa Ryan, who's from the Tsimshian Nation. And we just started talking, and she had written her dissertation on salmon in forests and also on her ancestral knowledge systems and, the way of seeing the world, the way of valuing the world, the methodologies that were used. And it was just such a relief to hear, because I had been sort of fighting this institution of forestry, industrial forestry, for my entire career, trying to get the powers to be to understand the forest as a connected, sensitive system. And she just said, yes, well, that's our value system. And I was just like, from that point on, she just started to teach me about the methodologies of her nation, which is, as I said, the Tsimshian Nation. And we just started doing research together. And that's just expanded to where, all of my work now is with Aboriginal people and understanding, as I said, their ways of seeing and their ways of knowing and their ways of doing, which are much more embedded and more respectful of the land than the colonial approach. So that includes basic principles of, first of all, respect for the land, right? So respect meaning that, that you honor this place that is our home, and that we are that home too. We are nature ourselves, that we're integral with it, not separate from it, which is the first principle of colonial Western thought, is that we are separate, right? And from that, we've lost basically the respect for our home because we thought it was we were separate from it. So that's a major departure in the ways of seeing the world. The second thing that I learned so much was this idea of reciprocity. So reciprocity means that, first you look, you ask permission, and then if the forest is able to provide, then you harvest, but you always give back as much as you take, if not more. And so that means that the forest is under a continuous cycle of health and growth and well-being. And in Western forestry, that is not the case at all. We take and take and take, and we don't give back. And so then result is that these forests are, in my view, are being degraded over time. The third principle, I would say, is a deep, deep responsibility to the land. So that means that there is ancestral responsibility to look after the resources, care for the resources, and that is handed down through the generations. And in colonial forestry, that sense of responsibility to the land just isn't there as much. It's like, okay, I got a job here. I'm going to do this job for a while, and then I'm going to move on. And certainly so that at a personal level, at the industrial level, the big major companies that basically have jurisdiction over harvesting of the resources, they don't feel that responsibility to the land. They feel their responsibility to the shareholder, which is, dispersed throughout the world. So that's a major, major departure. And I think, those basic values and ways of doing things translate into a much different look on the land of what you have after you've been working with the forest.
You also talked about how traditional ecological knowledge helped you see forests not merely as elements in the ecosystem, but really as reflections and mirrors of the people who tend them, which I thought was a really important point because, as you just outlined in these principles, reciprocity, respect, responsibility, that involves the human being on so many levels. And so the forest becomes a reflection. Talk to me more about this.
So, I think that just to step back a bit and say, we all come from a deep ancestral knowledge base, right? We all have in us, in our DNA, a connection to the land and respect for the land. And so, this feels right in people. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why Finding the Mother Tree resonated so well with people is it tapped into the very fabric
of ancestral knowing that they have inside of them. Yeah,
absolutely. It touched them at the heart, and that's so great. And the spirit, right? The spirit of renewal, the spirit of longevity, the spirit of wisdom, the spirit of respect and awe and reverence for nature is in all of us.
Yeah.
So I just want to remind people that, if you feel something when you're in the forest, that's what's calling to you, right? You have that in you. I think in the industrial model, that gets stripped away. It becomes ignored, right? It becomes almost shamed in a way, right? Indigenous knowledge systems were basically laughed at for a long time by the colonial, movement into the Americas and disregarded and pushed aside. And we kind of fooled ourselves into thinking that we were separate, and we're not. And it was kind of easy, I think, for settlers to come and feel that way because they didn't know the land at that deep millennial level. And so it started to become, that unfamiliarity, that permission from the sort of that capitalistic movement that started with the Industrial Revolution, which started even before that with Descartes separating man from his body and man from spirit. Then the land started to reflect that separation. So if you look at, indigenous-led stewardship practices. I'm thinking of the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin, for example, or
Right.
in the Great Bear Rainforest of the Pacific Coast, where indigenous people do have the rights and jurisdiction to manage their own land in their own way. That those forests are highly productive, and they're diverse, they're carbon rich, and in fact, worldwide, there's a lot of evidence that indigenous-led stewardship, that those forests are more biodiverse and more carbon rich. The cycles are more intact. Contrasting with colonial stewardship of the land in Canada, I can speak to Canada in particular, that we've basically harvested so severely that we've pushed these ecosystems to the point of almost collapsing, to
Right.
where we're having, wildfires in plantations that were planted with flammable species, to the point where we're logging steep slopes and the slopes are giving way and sliding, to where we're flooding out whole communities because the headwaters have been cut 80%, right? That's a massive change.
How has, your learnings from traditional ecological knowledge, or in partnerships with Dr. Ryan and the many other communities that you've learned from and worked with, how has that shaped your relationship with Western science? Because the experiments you're doing with the mother tree, they come with the rigor of a Western scientific model, and you're trying to use that model to, I guess, prove something that you shouldn't have to prove, because it's already known in indigenous knowledge systems. So how are you bridging those worlds in your research and now in this application of your research?
It's such a great question. I'm trained in the Western scientific methodology. I use that methodology mostly because there are certain principles that are very useful. That indigenous science also follows, maybe not within the formal sense of an experimental design, but things like replication, right? If you repeat something you tried and it works in many places, then that's a principle of experimental design. If you randomize, that means that, randomization means that you're going to try this in a number of different places, but you're not going to select those places necessarily because you know it's going to work. You're going to say, maybe it's going to work over there too. So that there's an element of randomization that is also, basically used in indigenous science as well. And the use of controls, like what if you don't do something here and you try this over there? Those are all really good principles of any kind of testing and trying and experimenting with. So I still use all of those principles. I still use the rigor of Western science because those elements are intact. It's also, right now, it's the paradigm that is the dominant paradigm used across the world. And I would say it's only one way of seeing the forest. It's only one, it's not the only way. Repeated observations over time is another way you can do it. And unfortunately, we don't have time in our lifetime to watch a forest, go through an entire life cycle over and over again to that's one aspect. So just to say that, there's more than one way to look at things. Western science is only one way, but it's become the dominant paradigm. It's throughout all of our institutions that it's the credible way of doing it. And if you don't follow that methodology, your work gets ignored or criticized or disregarded. And so I see my role as I'm going to use that tool as a translator for the knowledge that I'm learning from the forest, from my indigenous colleagues, and try to get it out to the world in a way that is acceptable and understood, and it will get critiqued for sure. But it is a useful tool in that regard. But again, it's just one way of seeing the world.
Perhaps one of the biggest discoveries to date, and you alluded to this earlier, of the Mother Tree Project, is the degree to which clear cutting and the use of heavy logging machinery instantly decimates forest carbon stocks that have taken thousands of years to build. Mm-hmm. Tell me more about this finding. I mean, it's enormous in the implications that it's revealing.
It really It really is enormous. And I think when we were making this discovery, it was quite it took it was quite shocking to me. um, but so first of all, some of this is easy to understand. It's actually quite easy to count carbon and what happens to it in a forest. When you measure a tree, how tall it is, how wide it is, there are, about 50% of a tree is carbon. And so you can easily measure how much carbon is in the tree when you know the size of the tree and the number of trees. So it's very easy to count carbon above ground, like so the trees and the logs and the plants growing above ground. When you clear cut a forest, pretty much all of that disappears.
Right.
So, clear cutting takes down all the trees. That's why it's called a clear cut. Everything is gone. Basically, the shrubs, the plants, the mosses are also removed through the use of the heavy machinery. What's left behind is some slash, and usually it's it's the twigs and branches and any broken bits of wood that are left behind. And actually, that is kind of new. You could think of it as new material. Is still on site, but it's completely different than a living tree or a living organism. So you can assume that almost all of the above ground carbon pool is removed with the clear cut, except for this new slash. Then the second thing, and this is the most important discovery, is that we also found that the forest floor, which comprises in a temperate forest about 50% of the below ground carbon pool. Okay, so just to put in, what is the below ground carbon pool? That's all the carbon that's in the organic layer on the top. We call that the forest floor, and all the carbon that's in the mineral soil. So that is basically sequestered and attached to all of the mineral particles in the soil. That contains about half of that is in the mineral soil, half of that is in the forest floor, and that total amount in a temperate forest is about equal to the amount that's above ground, which is the part that you actually see when you're walking through the forest. So we found that when you do this harvesting, this harvesting has evolved over the last few decades to where it's most cost effective to drag an entire tree out of the forest, delimit at the landing, meaning cut off all of its branches and needles at the landing, bucket into lengths, and then put it on a logging truck. So the act of dragging that whole tree through the forest really disrupts that forest floor, and takes all that sort of labile carbon and nutrients that are in the needles and leaves off the site, leaving a very damaged forest floor. So we found that we lost 61% of that forest floor through the act of doing this whole tree logging.
Wow.
Yes. And thinking, why is that so devastating? It's because it did take 10,000 years to develop that forest floor. Soil processes, we call them pedogenic processes, by their very nature are very slow and happen over thousands of years. And so the instant destruction, I thought, was absolutely devastating. I have another part to that story that isn't quite so devastating, but that was a big finding from the mother tree. And it didn't matter where you were. It was whether you were in a dry forest, a moist forest, a wet forest, a cold forest. It was the same result across all of our 9 sites. The other thing we found is that it didn't matter actually if you clear cut the forest or did selective harvesting. If the machines were on the site and moving around and dragging things around, that was the key. It was the machines themselves that were doing the damage and the dragging of the trees out of the site.
Right, and I guess the implications for this, are far-reaching. But the idea that one could replant a forest in an environment where you've decimated it to the degree you were describing becomes an enormous obstacle.
Yeah, you can replant those forests. And the idea in Canada was to convert the old growth and primary forests. So a primary forest is the forest that's never been logged before. And the idea was to convert those old and primary forests to what Europeans call the normal forest. And a normal forest is a plantation, basically, that follows a bell curve or a normal curve. So you've got a fairly narrow range of sizes of trees and also species mixes. So these very simplified forests. that means that there isn't as much biodiversity. There isn't the capability to actually photosynthesize as much as a multi-layered old forest. And so replanting the forest sounds okay, we can do that and we can actually establish the forest even in a diminished forest floor, but what we're establishing isn't the same thing that we took away. And so those two combined, the loss of some of the forest floor, which is where the soil food web is, and all those mycorrhizal networks are in that forest floor, it's diminished, and also you're planting back a very simplified forest, and those two things together mean that the forest isn't coming back to where it was before.
One of the most interesting things from your book and the research was how you described the relationship between salmon and forests and trees.
Yeah.
And I found this beautiful because it spoke to perhaps another dimension of relationality that exists in the forest that you wouldn't normally expect,
Yeah.
and one that's really understood by indigenous communities. And you write about how salmon-rich forests offer yet more evidence of how death creates the currency for the next generation. So I wonder if you could talk about this and this relationship between salmon and trees.
Yeah. Okay. So what we're talking about here is the agency in the more than human world and the human world to work together to create a beautiful thing. And let me preface the story of the salmon with that. The previous thing that I just said, that we're diminishing the forest floor through harvesting and that this is devastating, is that we're actually finding that forest floor is recovering fairly quickly. Okay, so this is new information. We're just analyzing that data, and it's another one of those incredible aha moments. And that the salmon story illustrates largely I think what's going on. So, the details are different for my forest, but it's the same concept of the human and the more than human world working together to create a beautiful thing, a forest that is beautiful and productive and diverse. So in the salmon story, it's a beautiful example of how indigenous people have increased the health and the wealth of the ecosystems through their stewardship practices. And so along the Pacific coast, many of the coastal nations, so that would include the Haida, the Tsimshian, the Haltsik, the Nuhak, the Kwakwaka'wakw, the Nuu-chah-nulth nations, Coast Salish, would build what were called salmon stone traps. And those salmon stone traps are arcs of rock wall along the Pacific, along the estuaries, where when the tide would come in during spawning season, that salmon would get trapped behind these stone walls. And the people would selectively harvest those fish, letting the big fish, the big mothers and fathers, go upstream to spawn or go back out to the ocean. And then they would keep just the smaller fish. And so in a way, they were selectively harvesting the fish to encourage the retention of the bigger fish. So bigger fish create bigger fish down the road. They were also able to, moderate their harvest depending on what the population was like. So there's ebbs and flows in the size of those populations. And so then they could shift the harvesting where they were doing the fishing from year to year. This is great care, right? This is really tender care of the ecosystems. It's careful monitoring, careful observation, being there on the land to do that year after year after year, and being handed down this knowledge through the generations. So the fish then that were allowed to go up to spawn, these great big fish would go up and spawn, and then they would die. The parents would die on the riverbank after they left their eggs, and then there would also be bears and wolves and eagles, hunting to get food from these spawning salmon. And they would carry some of the salmon into the forest, or a lot of it they would carry into the forest, which made sense because there's a lot of cover there. And if there's cubs or little ones around, they can protect them under the shade of the big old trees. And so you can actually, in our research, we would go into these forests and we'd find the bear beds where they would lay under the big trees, and you could see the bones of the salmon. And even in case lots of salmon themselves that were left behind. And so the salmon then would decay because a lot of the body was left behind. The bears and the wolves are very selective about what they will eat, because they're trying to avoid parasites and so on. So a lot of the flesh decays right on spot and then enters into the soil food web. And the mycorrhizas will pick up those salmon remains, the amino acids, and basically deliver them right into the tree. And so people have been using N15 analysis, looking at the heavy isotope of nitrogen, which accumulates in salmon when it's out in the ocean, as a signature of salmon abundance in those trees. And so that's why, we know that there are salmon in these trees. And of course, the more nitrogen, the more phosphorus, the more fertilizer that the salmon provides, the bigger the trees grow. And our research also shows it changes the entire soil food web so that the whole species composition changes because of the salmon itself. The soil is shaped by the salmon, the trees are shaped by the salmon, and the productivity of the forest is really, really high, which then, provides better habitat for the streams and the spawning salmon coming up, which of course increases salmon populations. So it's a beautiful circle of life that shows how human stewardship, careful stewardship, really enhances the population of salmon, but also the productivity of the forest and its ability to sequester and store carbon.
It's a beautiful example of, as you said, like a circular way of supporting relationships. And you alluded at the beginning of your response to how this was playing out in the Mother Tree Project, perhaps in a way that's different than this salmon story. Can you share a little bit about that, or is it yet to be talkable?
It's barely talkable. We've been looking at this data now for the past year, I would say, and we're just about to write up our papers. So it's pre-publication. But what we're seeing is much to my surprise, because I think that the surprise to me is because I've been into so many forests where the forest floor has gone from, being in some cases a meter deep to just being like a few centimeters thick. And this is, this is from multiple rotations of industrial forestry and to where the forest floor keeps getting more and more, there's more and more loss over time. And I think it's because, and I surmised that it was because not only was there the logging impact, what I call the chainsaw effect, but afterwards, if you don't have trees and plants in place feeding the soil food web, that the forest floor starts to collapse. And so it's really, so the learning for us in this new finding, so I'll repeat that new finding, which is in the Mother Tree Project, we saw a 61% loss in the forest floor from the active logging, which I call the chainsaw effect. And then 2 to 3 years later, we found that it's starting to grow back. So it's recovering. So it's actually, in many cases, doubled in size. So, we've diminished it, but then it's grown back like by half, I would say. So I need to be very careful about these numbers because we're just analyzing them, but it's a significant recovery. And this is my theory, is that by leaving behind the big old trees, so in different patterns, and encouraging the growth of the understory plant community, the shrubs and the plants, not herbicide spraying, which is a common practice, especially I would say in the US, or any brushing where we're removing plants in order to allow the conifers to just grow. If we allow those to just do their thing, recover, and with the big old trees, that we're pumping a large amount of carbon into the ground. So through photosynthesis, a lot of it ends up in that soil food web. And the soil food web, which includes many trophic levels of soil creatures, bacteria, fungi, nematodes, mites, collembola, centipedes, millipedes, tardigrades, entire complex self-organized food webs, they're doing their work of using that energy and they're decomposing that fresh litter and they're building back the forest floor. I just think it's such a, it's such a great, example of this more than human world, doing their thing, which is to heal the earth.
Data that has come out of the project shows that the location of a forest matters deeply to the way it is tended. Essentially, a homogeneous response to clear cutting does not work. It has to be place specific. I wonder if you can talk about this, because it kind of, I guess, touches on so many things you spoke about already. In traditional ecological knowledge systems, place-based learning is so different based on millennia of observation. You can't just apply anything to every place, whether that be extraction or solutions.
Yes, that's right. So again, getting back to knowing the land, that's a really serious thing that, you need to know, what kind of an ecosystem is it? Is it rich? Is it wet? Is it dry? Is it poor? Is it inland? Is it coastal? Is it in an inlet? Is it up a stream? All of the processes are very specific to those places. And to really work with a forest or any kind of ecosystem in a really meaningful, craftsman-like way to engender this, this productivity, you really got to understand. You don't need to know all the detailed science, but you need to know the place and to know it through time. And that is not what we've been doing for quite a long time. And we do it to a certain extent, like we've mapped out ecosystems to a certain extent. We've classifications of ecosystems. We can go to our guidebooks. Basically a lot of it is guidebook led. But knowing that piece of land is really important so that you can monitor it, adapt to it, work with the plants, know what the companion plant should be, what trees belong together. That's what I mean by place-based is it really does. It is very specific to what's going on at each place and the broader landscape or context within which it is, which is not what we're doing right now.
Yeah. The central hypothesis of the project, or at least how I read it, was also about the potential for reseeding a forest, the mother tree's role. There's many things this project is trying to show. It is interconnected in the way that you want it to be, which is what I found so inspiring about it. But this reseeding piece was really interesting to me. I wonder if you can talk about this and the role that mother trees play in reseeding and regenerating forests.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. In the industrial forestry model, we replant forests. Replanting is fine, but the whole idea is very economically driven. So replanting a forest means that you grow seedlings in a nursery of a certain species, and we tend to focus on the ones that are fast growing and commercially very valuable, historically been commercially valuable. We go out and we plant those seedlings. There are genotypes that are supposed to be matched to the site. And so there's been all kinds of genetic studies to show that you can move, seed from over these quite large distances. But the idea behind growing these seedlings that are matched genotype to the site, more or less, is that they can get a head start and grow fast. And in order to grow fast and big, they basically have been bred to grow big stems so that, they're not bred to grow big, deep root systems. They're bred to grow big stems because that's where the money is. And so then, that forest then becomes a tree farm, right? We're farming trees for the next rotation. Okay, so they tend to be simplified because we're all trying to grow big trees and we're trying to grow like only a handful of species. Whereas a forest with these old trees left behind, they'll seed into the forest. And then if you leave multiple species behind, you'll get multiple species seeding in, and they generally come in great abundance. And when they germinate on the ground, and they'll germinate, like in some of our sites, we're getting thousands and thousands of seedlings come back, underneath an old tree. In some cases, like tens of thousands of trees per hectare. And so when they germinate, the seedlings are, which is a miracle, right? A seed germinating and becoming a plant is a miracle. But their roots really start to explore to get into the soil to get what the seedling needs. And so I call them like guerrilla root systems. They're designed to get to get the needs met. Whereas a nursery grown seedling, it's like a carrot, right? It's confined into this little plug. And then over the course of a few years, the the roots will kind of find their way through, and they'll send out like a root here and a root there. Meanwhile, that naturally regenerated seedling is like, it's totally adapted to the site. It's got roots everywhere. It's getting the water and the nutrients, and they're like, they're like really great soldiers in the forest. And so why is this important? Well, for one, you've got that better root system, but you've also got precisely adapted seed for the site, not generally adapted. So they've come from that site. Also, our research is showing that the trees that provided that seed can recognize which are their own offspring. And so they start to communicate with those offspring through the soil and through the mycorrhizas. And even people have been researching communication of kin through the air. And so they will create conditions that will favor the survival of those seedlings, or the adaptive traits of those seedlings. And so you have a lot going on there to favor those naturally regenerated seedlings. And, in a lot of cases, when you go into a forest in British Columbia, maybe it's been 20 or 30 years after the plantation, and, the natural seedlings will be the ones that are doing the best.
Right.
So it's not that planting is bad. I'm not saying that. It's just that it's only one thing, and that we've ignored this natural regeneration for a long time. And yet it is, especially when sites are under stress, climatic stress, it's those really, wily seedlings that are the ones that are going to make it through.
Right. And they hold knowledge. These seedlings hold knowledge because they are extensions of the mother tree versus a replacement species, which has knowledge of its own. But if it's been breeded for a specific purpose, it's not in relation to place and the knowledge within that forest floor. I mean, there's so many levels to what your study is revealing here about, how we can conceive of not only healthy forest practices, but really just the intelligence that's held within the forest. I mean, I think that's what your work all those years ago really sparked, was the realization that, and this goes deeper. And, one of the things I was reflecting on when reading your book was, what are the deeper lessons here, beyond what the study is revealing and the practical applications, but the deeper lessons that are trying to be revealed to us as a species. I mean, I know you've thought a lot about this because you don't just want to say this is the science alone, this is how it is applied to a forest in British Columbia. You've always wanted to broaden the discussion to how we think about our relationship to the living world more broadly as a species.
Yeah, I think that what this kind of work shows, and it's not just mine, many people are really building out this knowledge, is that the forest is an intelligent system. It's full of, it's got the genetic knowledge in it to rewire itself, to be healthy going forward. And I think that we need to be paying attention. Now, we need to listen to the forest. We all have that in us. We're capable of this. Everybody does it when they go to the forest. They can hear all the sounds of the trees. And right now, the trees are screaming at us and the forest that we need to recognize the intelligence of these systems. We need to break out of our little boxes and really say, what are we doing here? Because at least in my part of the world, wildfire has become, in the last 10 years, it's more severe, it's more extensive. It's like a lot of us are now fleeing wildfires every summer, and we call it now the smoke season instead of the summer season. That's the forest sending us a big message. Or huge insect outbreaks. We had the mountain pine beetle outbreak that took out millions of hectares of trees in the 1990s. Like, these are messages from the forest talking to us, saying things are not, you're not doing a great job here right now. And we really do need to listen and then use that sort of intelligence of us and how we interact with the forest to shift course and really start caring for these places.
Another thing that struck me in reading the book was kind of the larger story of primordial cycles that you point to, and on many levels, and within your own life too, and how that was revealed to you, and I wonder if you could speak to that a bit, the learnings or experience of cycles and how we're bound up in these cycles with the forest and the broader living world.
When you look at a forest, you think you're looking at a static thing, but what you're looking at is this incredible cycle. It's right before you every time you go out there. There are little trees, there are saplings, which are teenage trees, there are mature trees, there are old trees. That's a cycle. They're going through a cycle of growth and maturity, and eventually they become an old tree, and eventually they die and they become a log, and that log starts to decay, and that decay is fed upon by the soil and above ground food webs, which then transforms that energy that was once a tree into nutrients and other chemicals and other elements that the new life really needs to grow itself. So the old basically transmutes into the young, and it's really just a transformation of energy through those cycles. We follow the same cycles in our lives. We don't live as long as trees, but we go through that too. We're born, we grow, we mature, we die, we get sick, we die, and then our spirits, our energy is basically dispersed to the world, but it doesn't disappear. Right? It's transformed, and and that wisdom that we pass down to our next generations becomes, that energy and wisdom of those generations. So it's just a reminder that, that we are all part of the same cycles. Our energy is never lost. It's just circling among and being transformed into different parts of the ecosystem. And one of the reasons I really wanted to show that was I wanted to sort of dispel this myth that we keep ourselves and our forests in a never-ending young part of our cycle, right? That we're always young. We never want to die because we're afraid. And for a forest, that we want to keep them young because they're going to, we don't want to let them grow too long because we need to cut them down to make more money. And we keep them in this perpetually young stage. And by cutting off the elder, by cutting out the wisdom part, by not letting it flourish, we're really undercutting the whole cycle of the forest and our own life cycles. And so I wanted to show we're so similar and we're so entwined, we're in relation with each other, and that we're also part of the larger biogeochemical cycles, which also follow, a cycle as well. And the carbon cycle is really just that transformation of energy from the old to the young and back to the old again. And so to help people understand by really feeling like we are part of this cycle. We breathe out carbon dioxide and we breathe in oxygen that comes from the trees, that we're essentially in the cycle ourselves. We are the cycle. And I just wanted people to really love it, right? Not feel like it's foreign or alien or dangerous. We are part of it and we influence it all the time.
It makes me think about our fascination with perpetual youth in our current culture, and it's like there has a connection there. Just you describe wanting to maximize profit by keeping a forest young, not having the patience to let it grow old, and not having the patience to let ourselves grow old. Before you spoke about mirroring, or that had come up in your work about a place and a culture mirroring each other. I mean, there's so many depths to this relationship we share with trees and forests.
Yeah. That's one of the learnings that from going with my indigenous colleagues to feasts and potlatches and seeing the honoring of the elders and the honoring of the youth, honoring the entire life cycle. Right. It is just such a joy to have the elders there. I mean, I'm getting to be an elder myself. There is a lot. There's so much richness and essential. It's essential for our lives, for our learnings and our ability to be strong and resilient. We need people that have been through these things before and have able to pass on the ancestral knowledge to us, and to not shortchange ourselves by being so focused on the young and trying to cover it up and put our elders away. And we need to honor them and keep them here with us as long as we can.
I mean, perhaps that's a good place to bring up what I thought would be maybe the last question of our conversation, because I wanted to ask you about a vision that you share towards the end of the book of yourself being a mother tree, and a mother tree is an elder, and this mother tree in a vast community of living beings, and I wonder if you could speak about what it is in the image of a mother tree that we can take away as a model for a way of being or a way of orienting ourselves toward being in service to the future.
Yeah, I mean the mother tree. There's such there, there. I call them the energy centers of the forest, and but also the wisdom centers. So they're, a mother tree has a prodigious crown, a prodigious root system. It's got years and years of growth rings. And so there's a lot of when I say energy, I really mean that they hold actual photosynthetic energy in their bodies, and they redistribute that energy through the entire cycle or food web of the forest. And so they're really energizing, all of the creatures, the heterotrophs, the animals, all the creatures that are interdependent with that forest are interdependent with those mother trees because they are able to capture so much sunlight and turn it into the energy that drives all these cycles. So, and also the wisdom part of it, the seeds of an old tree are developed through through the lifespan of that tree. They reflect the lifespan of that tree. And in some cases, these trees can be thousands of years old. And so they've seen thousands of years of climatic fluctuations and, this calamity and that's come along, and they've adapted and changed. And so that is encoded in their seeds. And so that means that the seeds are not only adapted to the site, but they're resilient, right? They're mapped out to encounter odd things and still survive. And so that wisdom is in the seeds. And then, of course, in their tree rings, they hold stories of the past. How much salmon was in this forest, or how much of any other, creature that has some kind of a chemical signature in it that you can actually see. But those tree rings hold the stories of the repleteness or the depleteness, if you will, of the changes over time. So, and then of course they buffer climatic extremes. That's one thing that we're also looking at in the Mother Tree Project, is that they actually mitigate high temperatures, loss of relative humidity. They mitigate these things and keep it like a favorable environment for all the plants and animals growing in the understory of these old trees. So they serve many, many functions. They're the homes for bears in many cases. If they have a den, that's where most of the black bears and grizzlies will den inside old trees. They're host to myriad animals and mosses and lichens. There really are, the scaffolding of life itself in the forest.
Mm. Suzanne, it's been an absolute pleasure being in conversation with you again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Emergence magazine is an initiative of Calliopeia Foundation. Our original essays, in-depth interviews, films, and rich multimedia explore the threads connecting ecology, culture, and spirituality. Our theme music is composed by Logan Stalley and H. Scott Salinas. This podcast is edited by Erica Neiginger and produced by Shauna Quinn and Emmanuel Vaughn Lee, with writing by Lucy Warmald. You can subscribe to our podcast wherever podcasts are found. To subscribe to our newsletter, order our new print edition, and check out more of our stories, visit emergencemagazine.org.